All right, so I put up a video yesterday to go over one of the challenges, the palindrome challenge. So if you're interested in that, then please refer to that video. Given time constraints, this is already kind of pushing it, but we'll just dive right in and go over the README for today. So again, this is going to be basic React. So the guest lecture today talked about use effect, which is we'll get into shortly, but for now we don't need to worry about that. We're just kind of worrying about state and props and how we're going to connect everything together. So I've started this. We're going to go through this README and we're going to build a mute button, basically an application that has a mute button. So I've gone through all the boilerplate. I ran npx create react app. So now I have an app. Everything is set up. And I also have this icons folder, which I got by following the directions in the README. So if I want to just make sure that everything's running, I do npm start. Actually, let me go into app. Okay, and I get the default reacting. So everything is connected up properly. All right, so we're going to start. We don't really need to. So we'll start with this app. So let me paste this in here and then we'll talk about it. Refresh it or save it rather. We'll go ahead and open up the dev tools as well. All right, so can anyone tell me about this particular component?
It's a class-based component.
Yes. For a second there, I thought you said it's a cat-based component. Yeah, class-based component. Yes. Okay, so what kind of components can we have in React?
You mean just like function first class?
Yeah. So we have functional components or class-based components. This is an example of a class-based component, and you can know that by the class keyword, and it also extends or inherits from React.component. And the import statement, we're just importing the whole thing. You could also individually import what we wanted. So you could specifically import component if we wanted to up here. Either one works. And then what is this?
State that you're not going to mute.
Yes. So what is state?
It's an object.
Okay. And what role does it play in React?
Is it something that is expected to change?
Yeah, right. So it's something that can change, and it's something that when it does change, we probably want to do something else in our app.
I was just about to say that, but Christian took my opportunity to say it. So.
Well, Jose, I'm going to give you credit. Christian, I don't acknowledge your last answer.
I'll take the credit, yeah, if you're giving it out. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I'm used to it. It's okay.
All right, so yeah, so state is something that oftentimes state will change based on what a user does. It can also change based on, let's say, like a an API call or something like that. So we're not talking about APIs yet. So we're just mostly concerned at this point with something that a user does. So if this changes, we want something else to change in our application. All right, and what about this render method? Do we have to have a render method?
Yes.
If it's class-based, yes.
Yeah. So this is a class-based component, so we do need a render method. There's a whole bunch of other methods that we could have, like the lifecycle methods we haven't really talked about yet. So we could have a bunch of other methods, but the one that we need for sure is render. Now, if this is a function-based component, then we don't, it's kind of all a render. So you only need to return a value. But here in a class-based component, you have to have the render. Okay. We'll go back here. And we're going to add this toggle mute. All right, so let's, yeah, okay. So what happened here? So this toggle mute, we added a function, and this is basically going to be our click handler. So when someone clicks, we want to call this function. And what is this?
It's changing the state.
Yeah, changing the state. So how come we couldn't just do something like on click this dot state that is muted equals true?
Wouldn't be able to turn it back to false.
Yeah, but let's just say, even if I did, okay, so let's fix this.
Bad React manners.
Yeah, it's bad React manners. That's basically it. So you don't want to mutate state directly. So you don't want to, you should think of this as something basically like a private variable, or a private property. You don't want to be changing it directly. So you only want to do anything with state indirectly. And the way that you can access that variable or change it is through this. You can access it anywhere, but if you want to change it, then you should use set state.
It will still give you the same output, hypothetically, right? So,
Yeah, so I think at least temporarily, but there are cases where things can get out of sync. So
right.
It's it's one of those things where it might work or it might work for a while, but okay, and put this back. So this that is not muted, but toggle mute. All right, so we have this on-click handler. So this toggle mute, we change the state, not directly by mutating it, but by calling this function. And then we can pass in, if we had 10 other things in state, we only wanted to change one, you could just pass in the one that we wanted to change. It will basically do a merge, so everything will be fine. All right, so this is a very common structure for a React component where we have a component, and then we want the user to be able to do something, and that whatever that something will trigger a change, and then we want to change the state of our application. So how do we know if this is working? We can go here and click on it, and we can click test, and we have a console log kind of built in here, and console log is great. We should definitely be using console log as you're developing. But if we're using the React dev tools, that might be a good idea to have installed. We can, especially once things get more complicated, we can take a look at all of our components. So we only have one component right now, which is the app component. And we can see props and state here. So we can click on this, and then watch the state change from true to false. So this will also be helpful, and once you have more complex structures, the dev tools are very handy. Okay, so we know that this is working so far. It's changing our state, but we're not really doing anything based on that information. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another component, which is going to be our mute button component. We'll go into source. You don't, strictly speaking, it's not like Django. It's not like Django where it expects a particular kind of file structure. So this is just conventional. You could put everything. You could put everything in app, or you could put all your files here. But just for the sake of organization, it's best to put things in a components file. And in this case, we're going to have yet another file called mute button. And then our actual mute button. Okay, so we have another class component. It has the one necessary method that class components need to have, which is render. And then what we're doing here within the render method is ultimately we're going to return something, which in this case is just a button. But we're going to conditionally render either on or off. So what is this? And by this, I mean, what is the stuff here?
You're calling the information that the parent passed to it by this.props.
Yeah, yes. So props is something that you can give from a parent to a child. So right now, we're not actually doing that. This component isn't being used, but once we actually hook it up, then yeah, the parent will be passing a prop, basically just a key value pair called is muted, and we can use that within our component. And we'll fix that up here in the app. So we're going to add the mute button here. Just copy this to talk about it. Okay, so everything else is the same. We still have our state. We still have our toggle mute, which is our event listener, which we're gonna have to deal with later. But now we're incorporating this mute button. So how do we do that? So mute button is our class here. So when we write it, it looks like a class or a function, depending on what we're doing. But when we use it in another component, the way that React works uses JSX, so it kind of looks like an HTML tag. But really, this is, you could think of this as like creating an instance of mute button. And then here we're passing it a key value pair. So in this case, is muted, and that is going to be based on this state. So now we have, if you look at our dev tools, we have two components. We have app, and then within app, we have this mute button. And we can see that app has state still. We might fix that. And mute button doesn't have any state, but it does have props. It has this prop that it's getting passed. So the is muted prop, which we're giving here. So we change this. You can see that that is not actually doing anything because we don't have this toggle mute. This isn't being called. So we're kind of in an in-between state right now where this will happen as you're developing your React app, sometimes you get everything working in one component and you realize you have to move the state somewhere else. So there's this intermediary phase where things just don't work. Okay, so here what we're going to do is, so I'll copy this and we'll talk about how information flow works. Let me double check that.
You have to add that toggle mute property when you're calling the button inside of app. Oh, my bad. Do we have it inside of mute?
Let me see. So mute button, this.props that is muted, so that's getting passed down. That should change. So when we click, we don't have a handler. Yeah. So toggle mute. Is that not part of this? Yeah. Okay. So let me just change this real quick before you do this. Okay. Now we can talk about it. All right. So so app still has state. And if we look at our mute button, we don't have state, but we have props, and the value of the props will change. So there are two ways to trigger a re-render in React. Does anyone know what they are?
If you change state inside of the return statement.
Okay, so changing the state is one way to trigger a re-render. What's the other way? The other way is changing props. So the reason, so we could change state here, and that's fine. But if we also want to change state, in fact, React will re-render children components. But if you change props, it will also trigger a re-render. So that's basically, you don't have to worry about keeping things in sync at that level, because if something changes, then you can kind of count on it that you'll get a new component that will have the updated values. All right, so information flow. So we have state here. So state is still located in app. And this function is also located in app, but we're not using it in app. We're passing it down to this other child component, and then we're calling it there. So how does information flow work in React?
From parent to child.
From parent to child, okay. Is there any way to get information from a child to a parent?
You can change the props.
Okay, so if in my child, so mute button is a child of app. So if I change this in mute button, then app will know about it.
Callback function.
Yeah. So the thing is that you can't really pass information up. Information flow only goes top down, just like the military. So you start at the top, and then you pass information down to child components, and the child components don't have a way. They don't have a direct way to communicate with either siblings or parents. So if you want information or whatever to be passed from child to parent, you have to do it indirectly. So you have to do it through a callback function. So you have to give, the parent has to give the child a function, and then the child can use that function to do something in the parent. And if we had, so if we look at our structure right here, we have app and then a child component mute button. If we had another child, if app had another child, and these two components needed to talk to each other, let's say we had like a display message or something like that. I think that's similar to the palindrome challenge. If we had another sister component and the display message needed to change what it displayed based on whether the button was muted or not, these two components, because they're sisters, wouldn't be able to talk to each other. So they would have to do their talking in app, and then app would handle passing information from one to the other. So they would have to go through this. They would have to go through their parents as an intermediary. Okay. So getting that the basic concept, it can be frustrating, but if you want to pass information from a parent to a child, you use props. If you want to pass information from a child to a parent, you can't really. So you have to pass a callback function or pass a function from a parent to a child that the child can use. Are there questions about that? All right. All right, so what we're going to do here is just, we're going to add basically some front end flair here, and we'll use the icons library or this folder that we have. And we're going to have to pull this in. So now I have our two icons.
I think that block of code was supposed to go into mute button.js instead of app.js.
Oh, whoops. Not paying it. That's what happens when you copy paste. Well, I believe I've that. No, that was the old one. All right, let me go back here. Mute button.js. And our app. Okay. So we have our mute button. And now that the image is changing every time. So it's the same basic idea. We just have a nicer visual. Okay. All right, so yeah, we'll talk about, so what's going on here in the mute button is inside of our render method where we basically have two different buttons that we want to render depending on the state of, depending on what our, this prop is, what the is muted prop is. So we could do it like this, and that's fine. We can also use ternary operators, for example, to shorten this up a little bit. It's very common to see ternary operators and the double ampersand if you only, if you just have either something or nothing, you use a double ampersand. So now we're doing the same thing. We're still checking this prop. We're seeing if it's muted, then we're going to give this image, and otherwise we're going to show the other image. You can double check that this still works. Looks like it still works. Mute button. The props are changing, so that looks good. All right, so destructuring. There are a few kind of ES6. There are a few ES6 things that you'll encounter frequently in React that we haven't seen very much of before. One of them is destructuring. This is not strictly necessary. You don't need to use destructuring to use React, but it's just commonly done. So we'll take a look at that. So here we are taking whatever is in props and basically saying, I only care about these two things. So our props could have 100 things in it, or it could just have these two things in it. But if within our component, so we haven't seen this yet, but oftentimes in React, you're going to you have to pass props down multiple levels. And you might not want to use all of the props in every intermediate component. So you can just pull out specifically what you need for this given component. So this is just shorthand. We could, instead of here having is muted, we could do this props that is muted, but it's more of just a convenience. All right, so hooks. So we've been using class-based components, and that's fine. But as you've heard repeatedly, React in the last couple years has been moving away from class-based components. We haven't talked about lifecycle methods exactly, but useEffect is kind of a lifecycle method. I think it's nice to learn lifecycle methods using class-based components because it's a little more obvious what they do, and there are more of them, but we'll see that later. So right now we have a class-based component, and we're using state, and then we want to change state. We're using this built-in this.setState function. If we want to make this a functional component, we can change that fairly easily. So notice instead of just having a state object where we can have multiple things, we could have is muted, but we could have 10 other things in there as well. We could all declare it kind of in one spot. So when you use the functional approach, use state will create it creates this. It'll return the specific property that you want, and also the method for updating the state. So in a class-based component, you have this built-in this.setState. Here you get to name it whatever it is. So both of these could be whatever you want to call them, but the convention is have this be your state property, the one that you're interested in here, and then this one, the function that changes it, will be set whatever this is. So this is just a convention, but right. So use state is this hook, this functional hook. This could be blank, but this will be the initial value that state gets. So if we want to start off false, we put in false here. If we want true, we put in true here. This use state function will return two things, and we're going to grab them both using destructuring. So again, we don't have to do it this way, but this just makes things a little cleaner and shorter. And then here we have another kind of wrapper function. And when we want to change our state, we call, instead of this dot set state, we call set is muted, which is the specific way of changing this state and only this state. So if we wanted, we could add, you know, another piece of state, do something like something like that, and we'll call this something like that. This set is muted wouldn't have anything to do with this. So these two separate pieces of state, unlike in the class-based way, these are totally separate things. And then making this a functional component. So in this case, there's not really like, you know, the older React and the newer React, because this isn't using any hooks. That there isn't state or anything. This would basically be the same in the older style or in the newer style. But we can see we're still doing destructuring here. We're pulling out only the two things that we're specifically interested in from the props object. And then we're going to conditionally render one of these images. Wow, did you guys notice the performance boost? I think it's like at least 3% faster. Okay, so that is basically it. So just going through a fairly simple example where we're starting with an app. We have to worry about state and props and refactoring from class to functional. Other questions about that? So this is the meat and potatoes of React. Okay, if there aren't any questions, then I'm gonna quickly go over a couple of the challenges. Am I still sharing my screen?
No.
Okay, let me stop.